We are back on the record at the beginning of media number 3 of Elizabeth Holmes. The time is 1:36.
Ms. Holmes, did you have any substantive conversations with the SEC staff during our break?
No.
I'm going to hand to you what's been marked as Theranos Exhibit 201. Oh, sorry. Exhibit 201 purports to be Defendant Theranos Inc.'s responses and objections to plaintiff's second set of interrogatories filed in the Court of Chancery of the State of Delaware in the case Partner Investments versus Theranos Inc. with starting dates number SEC-PRM-E-0003334. Have you seen Exhibit 201 before?
I'm not sure.
If you turn to the page with ending or Bates number 3358. You'll see there's a request from PFM, and you understand PFM to be Partner Fund Management.
I do.
Okay. There's a request from PFM to Theranos, and PFM's asking Theranos to identify any commercially available machine that Theranos has modified for use to process tests on capillary or microsamples. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And Theranos then responds on 3362, which is, well, there's a response starting on 3359, but there's also a list that starts on 3362. And Theranos is responding that there are 4 commercially available machines that Theranos has modified for testing on smaller samples. Do you see that? There's Siemens, I think it's Advia 1800.
I believe so.
Okay. Does that look like a misspelling where it says Adva?
I think it is.
Okay. And then there's the BD Biosciences LSR Fortessa, the BD Biosciences FACS Canto 2, and the Drew Scientific Drew-3 Hematology System. Do you see that?
I do.
Was it your understanding that these were the 4 machines that Theranos modified in order to conduct testing on smaller samples and used these machines for patient testing?
Yes.
Okay, and did you have that understanding back in 2014 as well?
I'm not sure what my understanding was in 2014. I know that I was aware of use of all 4 of these platforms. I don't know when I became aware of each one.
Okay. But you were aware in 2014 that Theranos was modifying commercially available machines for use in patient testing.
I was, and certainly of the 1800 platform. Again, I'm not sure when I was aware of the other ones.
Okay. And then if you turn the page again to 3369, I'm sorry, 3363, then the next page. You'll see there's a list of a number of tests here, and under little d, towards the top of the page, it says Theranos states that the following blood tests were available to run on modified Siemens Advia 1800 analyzers in the approximate time frames indicated below. And there's a number of tests below that, about 49 tests that go over into page 3366. Do you see that?
I do.
And was it your understanding in 2014 that the Siemens Advia 1800 analyzer was being used to conduct testing for about 49 tests?
I don't think I would have known in 2014 that it was 49. I knew that we were using the Advia with our, what we called proprietary chemistries at that time.
So you knew that you were modifying the Siemens Advia to conduct tests?
Yes.
And I think before you'd said it was something in the range of about 60 tests?
Yes.
Do you recall that?
Yes.
So do you have any reason to believe that it was something more like 49 tests?
I don't have a reason to doubt anything that's in this document.
Okay. And then further down on 3366, Theranos then states, by way of further response, Theranos states that the BD Biosciences LSR for Tessa flow cytometer, the BD Biosciences FACS Canto 2 flow cytometer, and the Drew Scientific Drew-3 hematology system were used to process the complete blood count test panel. So was that consistent with your understanding in 2014 that these 3 devices were being modified in order for Theranos to conduct testing on the complete blood count test panel?
So again, I don't know when I understood that we were using those platforms. I believe on these we were putting our own proprietary chemistry. So these were the ones where we were making the antibody ourselves and then making the chemicals and then making the test and running it on these. And just going back to your previous question, my comment about the number 60, I don't remember your question specifically, but it may have been just on any open platform, not just specific to the ADVIA, so it may have included these Becton Dickinson devices.
Okay, so it might have included the test panel.
Yes.
The complete blood test count test panel. Okay, and what do you understand that the CBC test panel is that a short name for complete blood count?
I'm sorry. Here. Yes.
I'm just using CBC because that's my experience with that test. Would you understand that I'm referring to the complete blood count test panel if I
Yes.
say CBC test panel?
Yes.
So how many tests comprise the CBC test panel?
I always get this wrong. I think there's 13, but I could be wrong. It may be more than that.
Okay. So taken all together, the 13
It might be
that are
19. I'm not sure. Yeah.
the 13 or the 19, something like that, something less
Yeah.
than 20.
Yes.
So taking the complete blood count test panel together with the 49 tests and I think the additional, say, 12 or 15 on the TSPU, so is it fair to say that Theranos was offering something less than 100 tests on all of its platforms not all of its platforms, but on the TSPU and the modified platforms? Is that
I think so, yes.
fair? Okay, and with respect to the remaining tests then that Theranos was offering during patient testing in 2013, were those tests being conducted then on commercially available machines that had not been modified by Theranos?
In 2013?
Yes.
Again, I think that they would have been both in-house and sent to a third-party reference lab, but I don't know that for sure.
How many of the tests that Theranos was offering to clinical patients were being sent out to reference labs?
I don't know.
Who would know that information?
Sunny and our lab directors should know.
Excuse me. Did Theranos ever try to patent the modified protocols on these third-party machines?
Yes.
And was Theranos successful in patenting the methodologies?
So I know we filed applications. I don't know how many of them have issued and where they are in the prosecution state.
Is this was the patent process something that you would have been involved in?
It depends. For the ones that I'm an inventor on, yes. For ones that I'm not an inventor on, that's not necessarily.
Were you an inventor on any of the modified protocols?
So I don't know. If they used some of my original IP, then I would have been, because we would have, we essentially incorporated that into the chemistries that we implemented on these big devices. But to the extent it was specific to that implementation, then I don't think so.
Did you ever tell investors or prospective investors that Theranos was using third-party commercially available machines to conduct a lot of its testing?
So I don't remember specific conversations to that effect, but I know that we were very open about the use of, or the venipuncture essentially, in our wellness centers, including for people who would show up in the store, and that people who were interested in the company would sometimes go to the wellness centers and get a venous draw.
Okay. But the venous draw would be whatever blood samples were taken through venipuncture would be put on, that would be put on just commercially available machines that hadn't been modified. Is that right?
Generally, yes. We did also sometimes put the venous draw onto our proprietary platforms, depending on what the test order was and what period of time it was.
I see. When would you be putting the venous draw samples on your own Theranos manufactured devices?
My understanding is that was mostly early on in the process of launching the clinical lab, and that later, as we evolved the business model and sort of understood that price was the most important factor and therefore increased the venous draw testing, that we did not do that as much or at all at one point.
Did you ever tell investors or prospective investors that Theranos was modifying these commercially available machines to conduct patient testing?
Again, I don't remember specific conversations in which we discussed the modified hardware. I think I generally talked about high throughput ways of processing assays or tests that we had modified for small sample analysis, but I don't remember specific discussions.
What about Walgreens and Safeway? Did you ever tell Walgreens and Safeway that Theranos had modified its commercially available machines in order to conduct testing on smaller samples and was using those devices?
Yeah, again, when we moved to sort of the phase 1, phase 2 business model, we invented the nanotainer to accommodate that. And I thought that I had discussions in which we explicitly talked about the purpose of the nanotainer being to be run with these assays we've developed for small samples in a high throughput setting, and then that we would use the device in phase 2.
So you think that you would have talked about developing a nanotainer for use on the modified machines?
For use with the chemistries, or the tests,
chemistries.
and using the chemistries in a centralized setting where they could be run with many samples at a time.
Had Theranos developed a different nanotainer that would be used with the modified machines that was different from the nanotainer that was used for its TSPU?
So before we created that phase 1, phase 2 business model, the nanotainer did not exist. You didn't need it, right? You could put your sample directly into the cartridge. The nanotainer was created for phase 1, where the service offering became the chemistries with the nanotainer. And the TSPU was intended at that point to be used in phase 2, primarily, where you would collect the sample right there and put it in the cartridge.
So the TSPU can actually take a sample from a person without it going through a nanotainer?
At that time, the version of it that we had, yes, you could deposit the blood sample directly into the cartridge. You didn't need a nanotainer. It was designed as a near-patient device, so you would put the blood right in.
So what prompted development of the nanotainer then was because Theranos had modified some of these third-party machines in order to conduct smaller sample testing.
What prompted the
saying?
development of the nanotainer was the business decision that instead of doing what we had wanted to do, which is place our devices in the retail stores, we would first become a clinical lab, and all these samples would be shipped at the same time to a central location. And the invention of the nanotainer was we can still collect a small sample, because that's what the patient cares about, is the small sample, and then still run the small sample chemistries that we'd invented. And that was the purpose of the nanotainer. And then in phase 2, once we could get the mini-lab family through the FDA, use it in the wellness centers. Does that make sense?
Sure. So whose decision was it to change the business model to this phase 1, phase 2 model, in which in phase 1 it would be development of the clinical lab, phase 2 would be deploying the Theranos devices to stores?
So a large part of it came out of our discussions with Walgreens. There had been a lot of back and forth about the business model and the timelines and the regulatory framework. We also worked very closely with FDA and regulatory counsel to try to figure out how to do this right, because we wanted to bring up a large number, relatively speaking, of tests on small sample analysis. And so it was in partnership with Walgreens and based on guidance from both of our councils that we decided to first become a clinical lab while we worked to take the technology through the FDA.
Okay. And when you say we at the company, who made that decision on behalf of the company?
I don't know that it was sort of a single decision that was made. It was months of engagement with Walgreens, feedback from council, and ultimately a business decision that we, I guess you could say, was consummated with the amendment to the Walgreens contract at a later point in time. I don't think it was sort of a single meeting where we said, okay, let's make the decision. It was sort of an evolution over time.
Okay, but were you the decision maker on behalf of Theranos, and did you sign the Walgreens contract or the amendment?
I did. I signed many of the Walgreens agreements. I don't know if I signed all of them. And yes, I mean, I'm the CEO. I'm the ultimate decision maker for the company. I don't think this was a case where we sort of sat down and had a meeting and said, let's do this. I think it was after a lot of iterative feedback, a mutual decision with Walgreens initially.
Just want to circle back to a couple of questions. You mentioned sort of the phase 1, phase 2 model being the sort of the genesis of the nanotainer development.
Yeah.
When did, what time period did that take place?
So I don't know when the initial sort of idea, invention happened. I remember as we worked with Walgreens on how to solve the business model questions that we were contemplating, bringing to them the nanotainer and trying to convey that you could still do small sample testing even in a centralized setting while we were working to get the TSPU through the FDA. I can't remember exactly what year that was, but I know it was certainly before 2013.
Can I just ask a clarification question on that? So what did you mean by centralized lab setting?
So sort of the way I think about it is either you have the TSPU intended use case, which is you're with the box outside of a lab in a place where people don't necessarily traditionally do lab testing, like a pharmacy or a home or somewhere where a person is and you're just going to want to do one sample at a time. Or you're in a clinical lab and you have samples from other locations being sent in at the same time, so 1,000 samples may show up or 10,000 samples may show up, and you need to be able to process all of those as fast as possible. That's a completely different use case than when you're with one patient at a time.
So you were saying that the model changed. So previously was the model that Theranos would be placing these devices in Walgreens stores?
Yes, when we signed the contract.
Right. And so how was Theranos envisioning processing all of these samples if there were going to be, you know, all of these people coming into Walgreens stores to have their blood tested?
So it's a different use case where you're doing one patient at a time. So one person would come in, their cartridge would be placed into the device right there, the results would be reported, then you do the next one. As opposed to at a lab, you're collecting samples all day, then you ship them, and so a large number of samples come in at the same time.
I also want to follow up on another answer you gave about being open about Theranos' use of venipuncture.
Yeah.
I think the question involved, disclosing the use of third-party analyzers. I guess, in your mind, what was the relationship between the use of venipuncture and the use of third-party analyzers?
So, in general, we associate and sort of talked about venipuncture as being synonymous with the use of third-party analyzers. I want to qualify that by saying that we did take smaller samples and did sometimes run the smaller venous samples on our proprietary platforms, but over time, as we began to do more and more venipuncture testing, for example, our Arizona lab was only commercially available equipment, and that was sort of what we associated with being synonymous with venipuncture for the most part.
And I guess, did you, so in answer to the question of whether you ever disclosed to investors or potential investors Theranos' use of third-party commercial analyzers, did you ever discuss the fact that venipuncture meant blood was being tested on predicate devices?
I don't know. I don't remember specific conversations. The best place that I can think of where that would have been explicit is when people came in for tests at Walgreens and got a venous straw. If those samples were sent out to a reference lab, that would have been part of the lab report that went back to their physician, so they would have seen it there. And otherwise, I know our lab openly discussed with physicians who were calling, if this test was run on commercial equipment, what the commercial equipment was and what the testing parameters of that commercial equipment was.
You mean the lab report would identify the analyzer that was used to process the sample?
The lab report would identify that a reference lab was used, and so that some type of commercial lab was used to do the samples. I don't know if the equipment was spelled out. I actually don't think that labs generally disclose what equipment they use.
Okay, so I guess, so just to walk through the example. And,
Sure.
And if someone, if a potential investor goes and gets a venipuncture at a Walgreens location.
Yep.
Would the results ever get processed in Theranos' lab? I guess if a reference lab isn't used in that situation, would the physician ever be notified that a third-party device was used for that sample?
So the instances in which I'm aware of it is if the physician had a question about the lab results and the lab test was run on commercial equipment. It was my understanding it was the practice of the lab to convey to the physician that it was a commercially available piece of equipment and what it was, and any information about the specifications of that equipment in conversation with those physicians.
What was that understanding based on?
Conversations that I've had internally with people when we would talk about customer service and trying to provide good customer service and answer questions, and sometimes even to give confidence to people about lab results that this was a commercial machine and this is how it performed and this is why you can trust these results.
Who was in charge of customer service at Theranos?
So it changed at different points in time. At one point there was a head of our call center. I believe his name was, but I could be wrong. And there would have been other people before that who were serving on point for the call center. I don't know who.
Okay, so would you hear that from them, or would you hear it through other people at the company, that the information would be provided to physicians as to which equipment would be used for the testing?
My memory is hearing it from the project managers who would talk about how sort of customer relationships were going. I don't remember a specific conversation with call center personnel.
So you mentioned earlier in your testimony that at some point Theranos developed a nanotainer and it was communicated to Walgreens that this nanotainer would be used with the central lab model. Did you ever tell Walgreens that the nanotainer would be used with third-party devices that Theranos had modified?
I thought I had conveyed that the nanotainer would be used with hardware that could handle a lot of samples at the same time. Again, it's my recollection that people were really to the extent that I was involved in conversation, the bulk of the conversation was about the chemistry and not about what hardware platform we were using in phase 1. Certainly people were really interested in the TSPU for phase 2, but I don't remember specific conversations about the hardware platform for phase 1.
So you said people were interested in talking about the chemistries more than the hardware, but, and what do you mean by the chemistries?
So if you take a step back, the value proposition to the customer, to the extent we're talking about our proprietary technology in phase 1, was that they get a finger stick.
Right.
The act of getting the finger stick and then trying to ensure that that data was good on the test was the focus of discussions. In phase 2, it's about a box, you want to get rapid results, you want to put it outside of the lab, but in phase 1, it was about, can you get a test to run from a really small sample, and can you do it well?
So, but why, I mean, there's no way to, let me just step back a little bit. So you're saying that the chemistry was really important, but the way that it's being processed, or the way that a test is being processed and how it's being processed and what machine is being used, how is that not integral to the conversation?
I think in terms of what people were interested in for phase 1, it wasn't, in any conversation that I was in, ever a discussion point. It was about, do you have a method for making this chemistry work on a small sample? And part of that was the protocol, part of that was, instead of having to collect a lot of tubes, standardizing that down to 1 or 2 tubes. And then can you implement it in a way in which you can handle volume? In phase 2, because you're trying to not be in a lab, there's a lot of focus on the machine, because now you're trying to put the lab in a box. But that was not what we were trying to do in phase 1. And for the most part, most of our conversations focused on phase 2 because we were trying to get there really fast, and as fast as we could.
So what about other people at the company? Did you ever have discussions with anyone at the company about, and maybe I should specify who, did you ever have any discussions with, for instance, Sunny Balwani about the use of these proprietary modified methods on these commercially available machines and using those modified protocols for patient testing?
I don't remember a specific conversation, but I'm sure I had interactions with him about it. I was aware that we were doing it.
Okay. And what about with?
I mean, I also don't remember specific conversations with him. I don't know whether that's something he and I would have talked about. To the extent we had conversations about the lab, they were more on the customer side.
Did you ever discuss the way the company was modifying protocols on these third-party machines with the project managers, or others?
I don't think I did. I can't remember instances in which I did directly.
What about with Theranos' sales team?
I don't think I did. I didn't have much interaction with our sales team.
And the marketing team as well?
Did I discuss modifying protocols with the marketing team?
Yes.
I don't think so.
Were you
It's possible, but I don't think so.
Were you overseeing the marketing team in the 2013-2014 timeframe?
When it started, she reported to me.
And did you know what she was doing in marketing?
I did, generally, yes.
Did you have regular meetings with her?
I had occasional meetings with her, but I missed a lot of them.
Were there any times when Theranos, I think we talked earlier about some of the technology demonstrations that Theranos conducted for certain third parties. Did you conduct those demonstrations for prospective investors?
We did do technology demonstrations for prospective investors when they were interested in it, yes.
And did you also conduct these demonstrations for business partners as well, like Walgreens and Safeway?
We did.
Okay. Were there other people that you would conduct technology demonstrations for?
I'm sure there were. I can't. I think I mentioned earlier, I know we showed the technology to our board. I can't remember other general categories, but I'm sure there were.
Did you conduct demonstrations for the Department of Defense?
I think I'm aware of one instance in which we did. And then, of course, the deployment that I mentioned earlier, where the TSPUs were actually in a number of burn hospitals.
So you remember conducting demonstrations at the burn hospitals?
No, the burn hospitals were using the TSPU on an ongoing basis.
Okay. Do you ever recall conducting a demonstration for the Institute of Surgical Research and part of that burn study?
I don't know if we did a demonstration before we put, I think that contract was 2008. I think we may have just shipped them the systems. I'm not sure.
Which version of the TSPU was sent to the burn hospitals for use?
I don't know. I'm guessing the 3.0, just based on how early the study happened. We may have later also used the 3.5s. I'm not sure.
So take us through the process of a technology demonstration for one of these groups of people. First of all, was the demonstration always conducted similarly? Did you make any distinction between investors or business partners or the board?
We didn't make distinctions that way. We made distinctions based on what people were interested in seeing. So there were some people who really wanted us to sort of show them what the retail experience would be like. There were some people who wanted to see what decision support software would look like on the touchscreen. There were some people who wanted to see the TSPU running right there. And depending on what we were trying to show, we would do different things. Some people just wanted to test the experience themselves, so they would show up at retail without scheduling something with us.
Okay, so I guess let's focus on the technology demonstrations that were not done through people just walking into a Walgreens store. Did you conduct these demonstrations at your office?
Sometimes, and sometimes we would bring the TSPU to other places and allow people to run it there.
Okay, so let's talk about the demonstrations that happened at the Theranos office then.
Sure.
So take us through the process of how a demonstration would occur. You know, would it be at the end of a meeting with either the investor or the business partner, whoever the third party is, and what would you show them, and how would you show them that the device worked?
Yeah, again, I don't think it was that systematic. I think we were very reactive to the audience and what we thought was most relevant to the discussions that we were having. There were some discussions that were focused on how you could deploy the TSPU, in which case we would run a sample right there on the TSPU. There were some discussions that were focused on the user interface of the TSPU and how it could be used for decision support, in which case we would show that. There were some samples where we would try to process the sample like we would in the clinical lab, and we would send it to the lab. It was run through essentially the product teams as a technology demonstration, and then we would report the result back like they would have gotten it if they'd gone to a retail location.
So in that last example you said there would be instances in which you would place the sample in, but the results would be generated sometime later and shared with
So we
whoever.
had.
Sorry, let me just finish.
Sorry.
Whoever was getting the sample. Is that what you were describing just now?
The last example?
Yes.
No, so that we had little rooms in one of our facilities, the 1601 facility. They were intended to replicate exactly what Walgreens looked like or was intended to look like if we were able to roll it out broadly. And you could collect a sample in there similarly to how you would at Walgreens, and then it was sent to our lab, just like the sample would be at Walgreens, and then we would run it, except it was outside of the traditional clinical lab process. It was actually product teams who were doing it, and we would report results back to people, is my understanding of how the process worked.
Okay, so in that circumstance, the blood would be drawn in a room,
Yes.
and then the sample would then be sent to the CLIA lab to be processed?
Yes.
Okay.
So just,
But just to be clear, I don't think it actually got processed through the lab. It was processed through equipment that was in the lab, but not the same way a sample that was collected at retail would be. Does that make sense?
Not really. So how is it different from how a retail sample would be processed?
There's some R&D activity that occurred in the CLIA lab, and I believe that these technology demonstrations were done through essentially the product teams, as opposed to the way a sample that was collected at retail would be accessioned and then run through the lab. So same physical space, but not through the formal clinical lab process.
And why wouldn't you put it through the same clinical lab process as other patients?
In the instances that I'm thinking of, you didn't have a requisition from a physician, so it wasn't an official lab order.
But I guess I just don't understand. Why wouldn't you just have that sample put on the same types of machines that a clinical lab sample would go onto?
It was my understanding you're supposed to treat R&D samples differently from clinical samples, and the clinical samples have to be ordered by an ordering physician, and they have to go through your essentially certified collection process, which would include our service centers that were listed for being able to collect samples and then run through our lab.
But it sounds like the clinical samples were being put through sort of a higher standard process than some of the R&D samples, because
it was a more controlled process.
It was a more controlled process. Yeah. There was a different validation process that the CLIA lab had to go through in validating the test. Why wouldn't you just,
Yes.
since you already had that framework in place, why wouldn't you just put the demonstration samples through that same higher standard process?
In some cases, if someone wanted to go to a retail location, you would. It's my understanding that there had to be a separation between anything that was done sort of in a research or demonstration type setting and something that was actually ordered clinically as an official medical result.
So what were the machines that were being used to process the technology demonstration samples?
I don't know specifically. It would have been generally reflective of what we were doing in the clinical lab, but not necessarily the same.
So, but were you aware of instances in which those technology demonstration samples were run on third-party but modified devices?
I can't sit here and recall a specific instance, but I certainly knew we were running what we called our chemistries on modified systems in the lab. So if that was used for a demonstration, it would have been reflective of what we were doing for traditional lab testing.
And were you also aware that sometimes these technology demonstration samples were being tested on just commercially available third-party machines without any modifications?
To the extent we were running fingerstick, I don't think we generally did that. There may have been an exception or two, but that wasn't our general practice.
Okay, so if you were doing a fingerstick demonstration, it would generally be put on, or your practice at least, and what you were aware of was that they would be tested either using the TSPU or the third-party modified devices.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the building at 1601 a few minutes ago, and if I understood your answer, you said that there was a CLIA lab space there, but that there were some R&D activities conducted in there. Did I understand that?
Yes.
Correctly. Was there where was the CLIA lab at 1601?
So I think originally it was upstairs and downstairs, and I'm trying to remember if it started upstairs and then expanded downstairs. I'm not completely sure, but there was a part of the clinical lab was on our first floor, and then it I think it later expanded to the second floor downstairs.
And where was the sort of the Walgreens mock-up room?
Right by the entry lobby to the building.
On the first floor?
Yes. Yeah. That's what I'm calling upstairs.
All right, I think I lost you. So,
Yeah.
so the entrance to the building is on the
Ground floor.
The ground floor, and then there's a basement to that. Okay, and so is it the original CLIA lab was in the basement?
No.
I got it backwards.
Yeah, maybe I didn't explain it well, sorry. The original CLIA lab was on that ground floor, which I was calling the upstairs.
Okay.
And then later we expanded to that downstairs floor, which I was calling downstairs.
Was there a separate R&D lab at that 1601 address?
There was.
Where was that?
That was also on the ground floor, the upstairs.
Okay. And I guess how are these labs separated anyway?
The CLIA lab that was on the ground floor was physically isolated. We constructed it to be a dedicated space, and then the R&D facility that was on that same floor was also its own contained space. The lab that was on the downstairs facility was also self-contained, although there was some R&D equipment in it at different points in time that was being used to evaluate new lab-developed tests to come up. And I think there were the dividers that you can put in rooms that just separated off that space so that they would be isolated.
Okay. And you mean contained space? There's like a door or a wall?
Yes.
Something.
Yes.
Was there a distinction in terms of where the commercially available analyzers were placed, either on the upstairs or downstairs labs at 1601?
I believe the commercially available analyzers were in the upstairs lab at 1601.
And were there ever, I guess, actually I think I understand your answer, thank you.
Actually, could we take a quick break?
Yes.
We're off the record at 2:18.
You wouldn't mind just taking a...
We are back on the record at 2:35.
Ms. Holmes, did you have any substantive conversations with the SEC staff during the break?
No.
So we were just talking about the technology demonstrations before we went on the break. And I think we were talking a little bit about the instance in which third parties would come to Theranos' office and a demonstration would be conducted there. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that process.
Yeah.
So when you did invite others to come to your office, and there might be a different purpose for that visit, but part of the purpose was also to demonstrate the technology, what would you do to prepare for that demonstration?
I don't know. I didn't generally interface that deeply in the preparations for anything that was associated with the clinical lab or sort of the demonstrations that ran in it.
So you mentioned there was a room at Theranos somewhere on that ground floor where blood draws would be taken. Was that also the room in which if devices would be shown to third parties, that room would be used to show those devices as well?
No, I believe there was a different room that had the devices in it, and it, to my memory, had a number of different devices, the 3 series and the 4 series models that we were working on.
Where was that room located?
Also on the ground floor.
Was it next to the blood draw room?
No, it was further down the hallway.
Okay, so you said that there were some 3 devices, some 4 devices in there. You're talking about version 3 or 3.5 and version 4 of MiniLab?
Yes, and that would have changed at different points in time. That's just a memory I have of the room, but it wouldn't always be the same.
Okay, and so were there already devices in that room? Or before a demonstration, would you need to instruct somebody to bring the devices into that room?
I think it depends on the specific demonstration. I mean, there may have been devices in there for periods of time, and then there wouldn't be.
Were there ever Did you recall any times in which you would request for Theranos employees to help prepare a room and to actually bring in sort of rows of the TSPUs into the room to make it look like, you know, they were sort of stacked one on top of each other in a row? Did you ever recall that ever happening?
For a demonstration? I don't think so. I mean, there were periods of time in which we had the TSPUs on racks in the R&D lab, and when we were at different points in time thinking about how we could use them in hubs, but I don't have any specific memories of demonstrating that necessarily.
Okay, so you just mentioned that there was a time in the R&D lab when they were on racks.
Yes.
And you said you were thinking about using them in the hub. What did you mean by that?
We would look internally at if you were to try to use a lot of them together, what would it look like? So they were on racks for that purpose, but I don't remember demonstrating that at 1601.
Why were you looking at running all of them together? What was the purpose of having them all on racks?
My memory was at different points in time we were trying to see if you needed more than one in a location, how you would put them together, and looking at things like whether they overheated and these types of things.
Why were you looking into having them all together, though? What, were you having discussions with another party about possibly putting these machines in a room, or why were you doing this exercise?
I can't remember. I just remember that early on we looked at a lot of different models of what you could do with these TSPUs and what the best way to build out the business model around them was.
Okay. So you mentioned also earlier before the break that typically you would use the same types of devices to conduct testing on demonstration samples as you would use for clinical samples. Do you remember that testimony?
I do.
So sometimes there might be an instance in which a commercially available machine that was modified by Theranos would be used to conduct testing on a demonstration sample.
That's my understanding from what I've learned about the demonstration process.
Okay. And did you ever bring one of those commercially available machines up to that demonstration room with the other TSPUs, or bring, you know, the third party down to your lab to see that machine, to say, you know, this is the machine that's going to be conducting the testing on your sample?
You can't move the commercially available machines. They're very large. I don't think we very often walked people through the labs. There may have been a couple of instances in which we did. I don't have specific memory of visits in which I was ever in the lab with people.
And do you ever recall telling the people whose blood was being drawn and tested that their blood would be tested on commercially available machines?
Not in the context of a demonstration, no.
So you just mentioned that the commercially available machines are typically very large.
Yeah.
How large are they in comparison to the TSPU?
And just to be clear, you're talking about commercially available machines, meaning the ones that were used for venous straws?
Well, are they any different from the ones that you had modified? Were you using the Advia also for venous straws?
We were, yes.
Okay. So I guess let's compare the Advia, the Siemens Advia
Yep.
1800 analyzer to the TSPU. So how would you compare the two in terms of size?
The TSPU is about the size of a desktop. The Advia is probably, I don't know, almost half of this table, maybe a little bit smaller.
Okay, so something like 10 feet across, would that be?
6, maybe 5.
5 or 6 feet
Yeah.
across?
Yeah.
And the TSPU is something like 2 feet?
I'll be wrong about the dimensions, but yeah, 2 by half of, I don't know, less than 1 foot, I think.
Okay, so it sounds like the Siemens Advia machine was much larger.
Yes.
By maybe 5 times the TSPU. Would that be fair to say?
Sure, about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you aware of times when Theranos would choose only tests that could be run by fingerstick to be tested on people coming in for demonstrations rather than tests that could only be run through a venous draw?
It was my understanding that to the extent we ran fingerstick, there were a limited number of tests that we could run on fingerstick, and so we would only run those tests on fingerstick.
Okay, but if somebody came in and asked to have a test done and that test could only be done through a venous draw, were you aware of occasions when you or somebody at the company would make the decision not to run that test because it would require a venous draw?
So it's my understanding our practice at retail was that we would tell people that we would need to drop a test to be able to run the order on fingerstick, and it was my expectation generally that the same thing was done for demonstrations unless we were trying to do something different, but that was my general understanding of the process.
So your general understanding was that if somebody came in for a demonstration and they requested a test that could only be done by venous draw, that test would be dropped and they would be told.
Yes.
So what would they be told about why the test was being dropped?
I don't know specifically. I wasn't personally involved in a lot of those conversations. I think generally our messaging at retail was that if you want a fingerstick order, you're going to need to drop this analyte. Would you like to go ahead with the test? And people would say yes or no, and we'd then fulfill the order based on their response.
Were you present at these technology demonstrations?
I'm sure sometimes I was. If we were talking about the TSPU and it was in the room, then yes.
Was Sunny Balwani also present?
In general, yes. I mean, I would want to talk about a specific instance to respond completely, but yes.
Okay, and were there instances in which neither of you was present, that somebody else from Theranos would be running the demonstration?
It could have been.
Who would have done it if it wasn't you or Mr. Balwani?
I don't know specifically. It could have been some of the different project managers, but I'm not sure.
So if we would talk about the devices, and you mentioned having a room with kind of multiple iterations of the device.
Yeah.
At one point in time, did Theranos attempt to develop a TSPU that had multiple ports or multiple cartridge receptacles?
We did.
When was that, and what was it called?
So wonderfully, it was, I believe, also called Minilab, and I don't know what years we were working on it. I would guess it was between 2011 and 2013, but I'm not sure.
Was it? I mean, did you consider it to be a 4 series device or a 3.5 iteration? I guess, in your mind, what category did it fall under?
I don't know if it was either. It was closer to the 4 series than the 3 series, but it was sort of its own category.
What was the? Did anyone ever call it like a multi-bay device?
I recognize that name. I think that was an internal name.
What was the purpose in designing that device?
That was in response to Safeway's request to invest in and develop a specific version of Minilab that could fit into the cabinets that they were building in the Safeway stores.
Did you have a understanding of why Safeway was requesting kind of a TSPU of a specific kind of cabinet size?
The CEO at the time had a vision for what the wellness centers in Safeway could look like, and he thought that based on the volume that they would be seeing in the stores, that multi-bay design would be the best design for the Safeway stores, and so we began investing in developing it. Is it
fair to say that the multi-bay TSPU was sort of another solution to sort of the throughput problem that you've described earlier?
It's a different throughput problem. This is a throughput problem at the point of care, but yes, it also would allow for handling throughput at the point of care.
What happened to the development of the multi-bay?
We stopped it at a certain point, and I don't remember when and why specifically we stopped.
Okay, so heading back to the demonstrations now.
Yeah.
So were there times when you chose not to perform certain tests because they could only be done on a venous draw than a finger stick, or that you decided to pull them from the list of tests that people would be coming in to do during the demonstrations?
I don't know that I completely understand. The question is whether we stopped doing demonstrations because we couldn't do it on finger stick?
Were there any times that you can recall where somebody came in with a list of tests that included a venous draw, a test that could only be done through venous draw, and you chose not to perform that test because you because it just couldn't be done through the either the TSPU or the modified protocol on the third-party device?
I don't recall instances in which we chose to do that. I recall instances in which we asked people whether they would like it to be dropped, and they indicated yes, and we proceeded.
Okay. And do you recall any instances in which you chose to perform certain tests on the list that people were coming in with, but to limit the number of finger sticks that would be done, and so would only be performing certain tests because it could be performed using a limited number of finger sticks?
I don't recall that. I know that, I mean, ultimately the number of tests you do correlates with how much blood you can get.
Okay, and do you recall an instance in which, you or somebody else at Theranos made the decision? It wasn't the decision of somebody who came in to do the testing?
I mean, specifically what decision, just so I best answer the question?
The decision to drop certain numbers of finger sticks from the draws because, let me just start over again. Was there ever any occasion where you or somebody else at Theranos made the decision not to run certain tests because it would require a larger number of finger stick draws? And so you would drop tests so that it would only require, say, 1 or 2 finger stick draws.
So I know that generally we were trying to limit the number of finger sticks you would do on a patient, and we had different rules at different points in time in our service center, and I'm aware that generally we focused on trying to have as few finger sticks as possible to improve the demo experience.
Okay. So why did you do that?
It just makes it a better experience for the patient.
Okay. But if somebody's coming in with, say, 10 tests, and that required 5 finger sticks, even if it doesn't create a better experience for them to do the 5 finger sticks, why wouldn't you just do the 5 finger sticks for them? I'm just, if you understand, I'm not really understanding why the better patient experience trumps what a patient would want to get done.
I don't think we offered that. I think we, as part of the service offering, set a limit of finger sticks. I believe it was 3 at retail, and if it was ever more than 3, then we would just automatically revert to the butterfly needle draw in the arm. And for demos, I think we generally tried to have it be as few as possible.
How many tests could be run on a single finger stick draw?
So it depends on how much blood comes out of the person's finger, which is different, person by person.
Okay, let's say you're able to get the max amount of blood on a single finger stick. How many tests could be run on that finger stick draw?
A large number. I mean, you can get hundreds of microliters out of a finger if you get the max amount of blood. So, a complete order.
What is a complete order?
It's generally 3.2 CPT codes, which is 30-something tests or more.
So Theranos was able to run 30-something tests on a single finger stick draw of blood, so long as it was the maximum amount. Is that?
That's my understanding.
Your understanding?
Yeah.
I'm going to hand to you what's been marked as Theranos Exhibit 202.
Do you want?
Oh, you can put that aside. Thank you.
Thank you.
Theranos Exhibit 202 purports to be an August 13th, 2013 email from Elizabeth Holmes with a copy to Sunny Balwani. Subject line is read devices in the demo room for tomorrow's meeting starting with Bates number TS-0375316. Have you seen Theranos Exhibit 202 before?
I don't recognize it, but I see the email to and from me.
Did you draft and send Exhibit 202 on or about August 13th, 2013?
I don't have any reason to doubt it.
Okay. You'll see in the bottom half of the email is sending an email to you and Sunny Balwani. Do you see that email?
Yes.
And he writes, the following devices are planned to be in the demo interview room. Number 1, 3.5 Edison with demo app set to run null protocol. Number 2, 4S with demo app set to run null protocol. And number 3, Minilab with demo app set to run null protocol. And then finally, number 4 is Minilab with demo app. Note that this will not be able to run the null protocol due to old pipette nozzles that fail once they initialize in the protocol. We can keep this in the room for show, but if we demo on a Minilab, it should be the other Minilab. Do you see that?
I do.
What is the demo app that is being put on these machines?
I don't know.
And what did you understand null protocol to mean when you received this email?
I'm not sure what I understood at the time. I was speculating earlier that it's probably one of the test protocols or QC protocols.
Okay. Do you think the demo app and the null protocol could be the same thing?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Did you ever ask Lynn what he was talking about after he sent this email?
I don't know. I assume I had some understanding of it at the time, but I don't know.
You assume you had some understanding at the time?
That we were going to be showing Minilab technology for some purpose. I don't know if I knew specifically what this software was referring to or not.
So in number 4, where it says that the Minilab will not be able to run the null protocol because of old pipette nozzles that fail once they initialize in the protocol, were you aware of this issue back then in 2013? An issue with the pipette nozzles?
I don't know if this was a specific issue with pipette nozzles or just that this instrument hadn't been maintained, that there was just old nozzles on a device, so it wasn't, I'm inferring from this, able to run whatever protocol the other ones were running.
Okay. And then number 5, he writes, we haven't discussed this, but would you also like to have the 3.0 Edison that can run the H1N1 military demo on it? And so what is the H1N1 military demo?
I believe this was the decision support application that we'd built, the user interface.
What is that decision support?
So when we were talking earlier about different purposes of different demos, on the software side, one of the greatest utilities that we thought we'd have with the device was the ability to have untrained operators put a series of inputs in based on symptoms and then be able to show on the screen, based on the inputs they put in, what condition they had. And so that one just ran, I think, that specific software.
So the H1N1 military demo, that's where people put in symptoms and what it tells you what test to run?
No, this one I think tells you based on the symptoms whether you have certain infection.
Okay. So what does that have? What's the connection with blood testing there?
So the same machine that had the decision support could then also incorporate the technologies that we were doing for laboratory testing, and the concept is, in remote settings, you could use both the decision support as well as the lab data to facilitate care.
Okay. So you then respond in your email, yes, re 3.0, thanks. So you're telling him, yes, let's include the 3.0 mini lab. Is that your understanding of what you're responding to here?
Yeah, it looks like it.
Okay. So this email chain was being sent August 13th, 2013. Do you remember what demonstration this was for?
No, I don't.
It seems like as preparing a number of TSPs to be put in a room. Do you recall if he might have placed a commercially available machine in the room for view by whoever was coming by for the demonstration?
No, commercially available machines, to my knowledge, were only in our clinical lab.
Okay, so they wouldn't have been in that same room with these other machines?
I don't think so.
You can put that one aside. I'm handing to you what's been marked there as Exhibit 203.
Thank you.
Exhibit 203 purports to be an October 10th, 2014 email to Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes. Subject line is re-visitors to WAG Saturday with starting dates number TS-08309181. Have you seen Exhibit 203 before?
I have.
What is Exhibit 203?
It's an email to Sunny and myself about a demonstration.
And did you receive and review Exhibit 203 on or about October 10th, 2014?
I don't know if I received it at that time. I reviewed it later in preparation for testimony here.
How many documents did you review in preparation for testimony?
I don't know specifically. A number of them.
And what did they pertain to? What topics did they pertain to?
Generally, I don't know if I would categorize them all in one area. Our operations of the business over the course of the last many years. I'm trying to refresh my own memory and recollection on a lot of different areas, some of which I wasn't that involved in.
Were there any documents that you reviewed outside of being shown documents by your counsel?
No.
So if you take a look at this email, you'll see in the initial email on 982, which is the second page, there's an email to you and Sunny Balwani. And he says, where can I find the list of names you mentioned who could come into WAG on Saturday? Do you understand WAG to be referring to Walgreens?
Yes.
We will send over the different workflows for how we will accommodate fingerstick regardless of what's on the order and possible issues associated as requested. First of all,
We were discussing earlier.
okay, were they at one point a potential investor in Theranos?
They were.
So what?
At this point in time, were they a potential investor in Theranos?
I think at this point in time we'd engaged with them to be an advisor to us, and then later they became a potential investor.
When do you think I guess, how are they engaged? What advisory services were you engaging them for?
In general, the restructuring that we wanted to do by bringing in family controlled sort of funds or companies, investors, and then trying to structure ourselves as a private company, and they were going to be our financial advisor in that context.
And do you recall, I guess, how soon after the time period in which they were sort of in that advisory role, they also became a potential investor in Theranos?
My understanding is that the term sheet discussions with them were in December of 2014. I don't know when exactly the transition from thinking of them as someone we wanted to retain as an advisor moved to when they were looking at us as an investment.
Was there any discussion with you about them forming a fund through which these other families would be investing through?
I don't know. I don't
So,
know.
so when you said that they were performing an advisory role to Theranos, was it mainly sort of a finder's role to introduce Theranos to some of these families that Theranos was looking to obtain as investors in the company?
But initially, when I first met, the concept was that he would advise us and me on how to structure the company as a private company for the long term, and he has an advisory role with a lot of the people behind these companies, and so I thought he could be a partner in helping us to think about who to bring in and how to structure it, and ultimately, if we tried to say private, how to structure the company. Then as some of these families became interested, we were talking with him about it, and I think they became interested in potentially being an investor. There was a lot of discussions about that.
Okay, so when it talks about the different workflows that he'll be sending over for how to accommodate fingerstick regardless of what's on the order, what did you understand him to be referring to there?
So I don't know if I read this at that time. In having reviewed it recently, my understanding is he's trying to communicate around doing a fingerstick for whoever is coming to do the demonstration.
And why was it important to accommodate fingerstick regardless of what's on the order?
My understanding is that this was the type of situation in which whoever was coming wanted to experience a fingerstick, so we were going to try to offer a fingerstick for the demonstration.
And just so I understand, that's your understanding now, after having reviewed the materials. What was your understanding back at the time in October 2014?
I don't remember receiving this email or engaging on this at that time.
Okay, so then if you turn back to 981, there's another email from to you and Mr. Balwani, and he writes at the top, also wanted to send along our thoughts for how to accomplish the FS in the scenario their orders prompt Venus. So do you understand FS to be referring to fingerstick?
I do.
And would you sometimes use FS in your emails to refer to fingerstick as well?
I don't know. Maybe. I don't have memory of that, but I wouldn't be surprised if I did.
Okay. And would you use, would it be surprising to you if you used it in other methods of communication, whether in text messages or in other documents?
Again, I don't have memory of it, but I believe that's what it's referring to here.
He goes on to say, assumptions here from EAH are that we must not do Venus strong. We cannot tell them that their order prompts Venus if it does. Is EAH referring to you?
Yes.
Are those your initials?
Yes.
Okay. So what is he referring to here when he says that the assumptions here from you are that we must not do Venus draw and we can't tell them that their order prompts Venus?
Honestly, I don't know. My understanding in looking at this now is that this is a situation where whoever was coming had told us they were coming and that they wanted to do a fingerstick, and we were trying to be prepared to do a fingerstick. That's my best understanding of it.
Do you recall telling that that a Venus draw must not be done?
No.
Do you recall telling him that he shouldn't tell them if the order prompts a Venus draw?
No.
Why would it be important not to tell people that their order requires a venous draw.
I think this was a case, and this is my best understanding from having reviewed it recently, in which whoever was coming wanted a finger stick, and so we were trying to communicate to our teams. They've told us that they're coming to do a finger stick. Please do a finger stick.
Did anyone communicate to you that they wanted a finger stick for this visit in the October 2014 timeframe?
I don't know. That was my best understanding from looking at this document, that they'd communicated that to somebody.
But you don't have any memory of, back in your mind, back in the October 2014 time period, recalling a conversation with?
I don't.
Okay, so if you look down towards the middle of the page, there are two scenarios. I wanted to focus on scenario 1 first. So scenario 1 says, scanned order from VIP contains tests that prompt for venous draw. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And then there are two use cases, use case A and use case B. Why don't you take a look at that section of the email and let me know when you're done. What's the difference between use case A and use case B here?
I'm just looking at it again in that context. I'm actually not sure.
So use case A says venous is prompted due to some tests not yet being on FS or finger stick, but would otherwise prompt FS. Do you understand what that means?
Reading it now, it looks like he's referring to a hypothetical scenario in which there are some tests that have not yet been brought up on finger stick, but I'm not completely sure.
Okay, so in the next bullet point he says remove tests that are not yet on FS and complete transcription.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that?
Yes.
And then the visit is completed per SOP, and then he goes on to say negatives need to either tell the patient at the store that we will not run a few tests. This would require calling the store to have them tell the patient, since it cannot be handled through the app, or tell them on the back end that we could not run certain tests. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. And then use case B, that's venous is prompted due to volume of tests, but tests would prompt FS if ordered individually. What did you understand that scenario to be about?
My understanding now is that if the tests were validated on finger stick, but that there were so many of them that you wouldn't be able to run them all from a single visit's worth of finger stick.
Okay, so in other words, I think you mentioned something about a single finger stick draw. If the person was a good bleeder, you could actually run 30 tests. So you think that in this scenario, this person might come in with more than 30 tests to be performed?
I'm speculating. I don't know what he meant, but that's my best guess in looking at it right now.
Okay, fair enough. And then if you go to the sub-bullet points underneath, it says remove enough tests in SM to allow patient to proceed with FS. What is SM?
I don't know.
Is that the name of some system that Theranos uses?
I could speculate that it's a piece of software, but I'm not sure.
And the next sub-bullet under that will determine what combination of CTNs are required to complete the full order and communicate this before she brings the VIP into the draw room. What does CTN stand for?
Capillary tubes and nanotainers.
And then The next bullet point will collect the number of CTNs required with as few sticks as possible. She will flag the samples so that they are handled with extra care when they arrive at the lab. And finally, there are the negatives. The first bullet point, if VIP is a self-pay patient, cash or credit, then the receipt printed by the app will only show the test transcribed, which will not include all the tests on the order. And the second bullet point says, if they notice missing tests on the receipt, they may ask the WAG tech about it. Worst case, they would make a call, tell them everything is fine. Also be able to come out of the draw room once check-in is complete to welcome them into the room and distract them from looking at the receipt. Why was it necessary to distract the person from looking at the receipt?
I don't know why this was written here. My understanding is that we followed exactly what the SOP is that we did at retail, which is this case A. That would have been my expectation, and I believe that's what we did for this visit.
What's your basis for that belief? Did you review some other documents that suggest the SOP was followed?
I did not review other documents, but it's my understanding that that's what we always did.
Have you spoken with about this document?
I have not.
And just to check on a couple of things. So here, when this is referring to...
I don't know. I think so, but I don't know.
And then...
I think so.
And at Theranos?
She was, yes.
She was, okay. Okay, you can put that one aside. Handing to you what's been marked Theranos Exhibit 204. Exhibit 204 purports to be an October 13th, 2014 email to Elizabeth Holmes with a copy to Sunny Balwani, and subject line is retesting in Arizona with starting dates number THPFM 000-130-8054. Have you seen Exhibit 204 before?
I believe so, at least parts of it.
What is Exhibit 204?
An email exchange. It looks like it's actually several email exchanges. Originally between me and Rob Walton, and then it looks like later from our team to me and others in the company.
Did you receive and review Exhibit 204 on or about October 13th, 2014?
I don't remember that, but I don't have any reason to doubt this.
Okay. It's on the subject line of the email. Were there discussions between Theranos and Rob Walton at this time in October 13th, 2014?
I'm looking back at the original email, which is dated September. I believe that I met him in September and had discussions with him at that time.
And what were those discussions about?
Those are the conversations we were talking about earlier about the vision initially for what this could be with Walmart and what we were trying to do with low-cost testing.
Were you also having discussions with him possibly with the possibility of Mr. Walton investing in Theranos as well?
So we later had those discussions with Greg Penner, who's part of Madrone, which is the fund that Rob is affiliated with.
Okay, and when were the discussions with Madrone?
I don't know specifically. Around this time frame or slightly later.
Okay.
Did you meet Rob Walton at that BDT presentation or around that time?
Yes.
Which one was it? Did you meet him at the presentation, or did you meet him around the time of the presentation?
Around the time of the presentation, I had a physical meeting with him in Chicago while that conference was underway. I don't know that I met him there. but I met him around then, if that makes sense.
So I'm assuming your presentation was some amount of time. You spent more than that amount of time in Chicago, and
Had meetings.
And to the best of your recollection, he was one of the people you met there, whether at a BDT organized event or otherwise.
Yes, I had a meeting with him during that trip.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so if you look at, I think you're looking at that, the last page of the document, which has Bates number 63 on it. So the first email from Rob Walton to you is an email where he says it was great to meet you in Chicago last week. Do you see that?
Yes.
Then you respond back to him and you tell him that it was great to meet him as well. You then write, can arrange the tests and appointments for you and we'll follow up on this note directly. Do you see that?
Yes.
So you're referring there to, when you were referring there to arranging the tests and appointments, had you discussed with him the possibility of him coming in for some testing?
So I don't remember specifically, just looking at this document now, it looks like it's referencing an invitation that we'd made to try to show them what the wellness center experience could be like in the context of what we were trying to roll out, and if we were to partner with Walmart at that time.
So did you say that you believe that he wanted to experience the experience if you were to roll out with Walmart? Is that what you just said?
What that experience would be like.
What that
Yes.
experience would be like, okay. And would that include testing on the Theranos device?
Not necessarily on the device, but using the nanotainer for fingerstick collection.
Okay. And so did he tell you, I just want the experience with the nanotainer, but I don't mind which device you're going to be using to conduct the testing?
I don't believe there were ever conversations on what devices were being used to conduct testing in the clinical lab. It was more, we'll collect some samples from fingerstick and show you the experience of collecting a fingerstick.
So you never had any discussions with him about the actual devices that would be rolled out as part of a Walmart relationship with Theranos?
I don't remember the specific conversations. To the extent we would have discussed what we've been referring to as phase 2 of our model, we would have talked about our TSPU devices, but I can't remember a specific conversation with him about that. I, again, believe that this conversation, particularly with Walmart, was about low-cost testing.
Okay, so if you turn to 61, which is 2 pages in front of the page you're looking at. There's an email from, I think you've passed it already, so it's the page after that page. There's an email in the middle of the page from Rob Walton he's listing a number of tests that his doctor has ordered for him to do. Do you see that list?
I'm just reading it. Yes.
Okay, and if you turn another page over, actually 2 more pages on 59, there's an email towards the bottom of the page that's written by you on October 6th, and you're writing to a number of questions, it looks like. You asked, do we have our sign and branding on the door to the wellness center? You asked if there are desktop little bamboo trees in the room and either a small waterfall or some LCD display or a fish. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Okay. Why are you asking him whether or not those things are in the room?
Because we wanted to make sure that the specific wellness center that he would go to would be representative of what we hoped to have discussions with him about rolling out more broadly.
And then, actually, you'll see that before your email is on the top of that page. There's an email from writing back to you, and he says, please see my comments below.
Mm-hmm.
So does it look like he incorporated some of his answers into your questions in your email?
I think so. I can't
So for instance, on the first one, do we have our sign and branding on the door to the Wellness Center over the Wellness Center? And there's a dash, is going to be going to the store today to check it out. This will be there if it's not all there already. Would that have been response to you?
I think so.
Okay. So going back to that same page
Yes.
on 59. So after you ask those questions, you say you should loop in on this to ensure it is PM'd perfectly, to which responds done. And then you go on to say, also get his order in our system in advance so his identity remains confidential. Do you see that?
I do.
And responds, this will be done. Indicated that she will need to call the physician to confirm which liver function test to perform. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And then going up the page to your response back, it's on the same page. And this is still October 6, 2014. You then respond, do not have a call the physician, work with which ones we can run from the least number of CTNs, and we will do that. Why were you telling to instruct not to call the physician?
I don't know. I can speculate just on reading this now that it's because those are well-defined tests. It's a standard.
A well-defined.
I'm sorry. I can speculate just in looking at this right now that these are well-defined tests, so we didn't need to call a physician to ask what they were. Liver function is a defined panel.
Okay, so you're saying that it's asking, was telling you that would call the physician to see which test would be performed under the liver panel, and that you thought there was no reason to call the physician because you knew which liver panel tests needed to be performed.
I'm guessing, but just in looking at it here, that's my interpretation of this.
Okay, so why would you say work with which ones we can run from the least number of CTNs, and we will do that?
I think that in general we were trying to have as few finger sticks and as little amount of blood as possible for this and our demos.
Okay. Why, and in the end, did you end up telling Mr. Walton that there were certain tests that you decided to run and certain tests that were not run because you were trying to reduce the number of finger stick draws that would be necessary?
I don't know what tests ended up being run for that.
Okay, but did you tell him that there might have been certain tests that were dropped off the list?
I don't know that the tests were dropped off the list. I think we may actually have satisfied his order. I'm not sure.
But you don't recall any conversation of that nature happening with him?
I don't. I don't think I specifically interfaced with him on the demonstration, but again, to the extent we would do that, we had an SOP for that at retail.
Okay, you can put that aside. Handing to you what's been marked Fairness Exhibit 205. Exhibit 205 purports to be a December 31st, 2014 email from Elizabeth Holmes with a copy to Belwani and with subject line re-VIP tomorrow -PT PTT with starting dates number THPFM 0000331112. Have you seen Exhibit 205 before?
I believe so.
What is Exhibit 205?
I think it's an internal series of email exchanges about a demonstration.
Did you draft and send Exhibit 205 on or about December 31st, 2014?
I don't remember it, but I don't have reason to question the document.
Okay. So if you turn to 1116, which is the last page of the document, there's an email from, he writes in his email, there is a VIP coming in tomorrow with PT, PTT on his lab order. It would be greatly preferred to collect via fingerstick. Would it be possible to run PT and PTT from a CTN? Was VIP a term that you used to refer to people coming in for demonstrations, such as investors, prospective investors, business partners, the board?
I've seen the term. I'm not quite sure who specifically they used it for. I can infer that it was demonstrations that they thought were important, but I don't know exactly what types of people generally fell in that category.
Did you ever use the term VIP?
I don't know. I don't have memory of it. I might have. I don't think so. I may have adopted it if other people were using it.
Did you ever tell the project management team that certain demonstrations were important?
I'm sure I did. I can't sit here and remember one right now, but we always wanted to make the demonstrations go really well.
So, and actually going back to his statement where he says it would be greatly preferred to collect via a fingerstick, why would that be preferred?
Again, it's my understanding that sometimes when people were telling us they were coming for a demonstration, they would explicitly communicate, we really would like to experience a fingerstick, and we tried to do that.
Okay. If you turn the page to 1115, you'll see there's some back and forth that follows to answer questions. So, do you know who she is?
I do.
Who is she?
She's a scientist and now a team lead at Theranos.
Team lead, so what does that mean?
She manages a group of scientists.
Okay, and what does she do? What kind of science does she do?
Clinical chemistry.
Clinical chemistry. So what does that mean in terms of the Theranos business?
There's certain tests that her group focuses on that she has worked to get on the mini lab, and now we've just hired a new head of product development, and he's expanding her responsibilities to broader groups of tests.
Okay, so does she work on the assays or the chemistries?
Yes.
She does. So she's a team lead for one of the assay groups.
She is now. At this point in time, I'm not sure exactly what her role was. She may have been affiliated with the clinical lab at that point. I don't know.
Which of the assay groups is she a team lead of now?
The clinical chemistry.
Oh, clinical chemistry. Okay, and what does that mean in terms of what types of tests fall in the clinical chemistry group?
Chemistry panels like the metabolic panel. Again, her responsibilities are at this exact moment expanding because of the new leadership we've brought in on the product side. And we're particularly focused on only Zika right now, but the team of people that she's leading right now have expertise on those types of chemistries.
Okay. And there's also another person on here that we haven't talked about before. Who is she?
I believe she worked in the clinical lab, but I'm not sure what her official role was.
So, right, I don't think we can run PT and PTT on a FS right now. Previous runs were on TCAN in 1601. Since we pulled PT from TCAN a while back, I'm not sure either PT or PTT is validated using that method. Also not sure if there are still validated lots of reagents and controls in Normandy. The last PT demo I did was in October. I do have a good working PT protocol on FS, but it is far from validated. So there are a number of acronyms here. What are PT and PTT?
I believe this is referring to two tests for prothrombin time, and I don't know what PTT stands for, but I think it's affiliated with prothrombin time.
Okay. And the TCAN, what is that referring to?
I mean, reading this now, I believe this references to another one of the open platforms on which we could put our proprietary chemistries in the clinical lab.
Okay, and then 1601, is that referring to your office address?
The building that we were in at that time, yes.
Okay. And then finally, she talks about how there are still validated lots of reagents and controls in Normandy. What is Normandy referring to?
I'm not sure.
Is there a part of your CLIA lab that is called the Normandy lab?
I know they used that word to describe the sort of small sample fingerstick operations at that time, and yes, they may have referred to a part of the lab that way. I'm not sure.
When you say they, who are you referring to?
Our team at Theranos.
You mean everyone at Theranos might have referred to the lab as Normandy?
I don't know who. I'm guessing.
Did you ever refer to the lab, to portions of the lab as Normandy?
I can't remember specific instances sitting here, but I could have. I don't remember.
So is what she's trying to say here that there's no validated method that can perform the PT and PTT test on fingerstick?
I don't know that that's what she's trying to say. Reading this now, I read this as she's saying they've pulled the PT and PTT proprietary tests that we were, I assume, running from this email on fingerstick, but I'm not sure.
Okay. So I'm sorry. How is that different from what I was asking you?
I understood the question to mean, is she saying you can't run PT and PTT? And I was responding that I think she's talking specifically about the use of our proprietary chemistry on TCAN. I believe there were other ways to run PT and PTT in the lab at that time.
Okay, and would those other methods be on fingerstick?
I don't know.
Okay. So then if you go up one email from back to, he says, confirmed with Sunny that we need to make this happen for this particular patient. And then he says, note that we can run and report this as a technology demonstration. Why is he making that distinction?
I'm not sure.
Do you know who the VIP patient was
I
that
don't.
came in?
I don't know.
So if you keep going back, now we're on 1113 and 1114. At the bottom of 1113, you'll see an email from back to the group, and she says on 1114, the next page, I was thinking about this through my whole workout, so fun, and I think the best use of my time would be to practice doing the assays manually. And then if you flip to 1113, on the email that's Sunny Balwani writes back to her, back to her and maybe as well, he says, run manually but needs to be accurate. So do you recall that certain assays were being run manually?
I don't have specific recollections of it. Again, I was trying to speculate earlier about my best understanding of how these technology demonstrations were done outside of the clinical lab process, but I'm not sure.
Okay, and so who would have the best understanding as to how the demonstrations were run in the CLIA lab?
I believe Sunny would be the best person to ask.
For VIPs, would Sunny let you know how the demonstrations went?
I'm sure he did sometimes. I don't have memory of specific conversations with him. I'm sitting here now, I would assume that I would have heard if it was a problem, probably from the person that I was interacting with, because to the extent I was involved in this, it was because I had a relationship with that person generally.
Do you recall an instance where any sort of VIP expressed any concerns or had an issue with their tech demonstration?
I can't remember any time where that happened sitting here. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. I mean, we've been a startup, but I don't have a specific memory of one.
How about any instances where Sunny communicated that he had concerns about a demo to you? Can you recall any instances of that?
No.
Okay, and then turning back one more page to 1112, sorry, the other way around, turning to the front page. On December 30th, 2014, there's an email from, and he says, all results are ready to be released. Mentioned we should not report CL since it's so high. What does CL refer to?
I'm not sure. I could guess that it's chloride, but I'm not. I don't know that for sure.
Okay, and then he goes on to write, for added background, there are no apparent anomalies in the daily processing. Both ADVIA's past QC and daily samples, ISE, are within TAE with no consistent offset. Is QC quality control?
I believe so, yes.
And what does ISE stand for?
I don't know what it means in the context of this sentence. I know those words to mean ion selective electrode, but I don't know if that makes sense in this sentence.
And what about TAE?
I believe it's a reference to total allowable error.
And then he goes on to say, should we report with CL pending redraw per usual protocol, or better in this case to go another route, i.e. not including I think he means CL, on the report, etc. Do you see that?
I do.
What did he mean? What did you understand him to mean? Should we report with CL pending redraw per usual protocol? What was your usual protocol?
I don't know. Reading this now, I interpret it to mean, do we include the value on the report and then say pending redraw or not? But I'm not sure.
Was that your practice for clinical testing? If something was out of range, to include it on the report? But
I don't know. No.
Who would know the answer to that?
Our laboratory director.
Okay, who else would know besides the laboratory director?
Sunny might. I'm not sure.
Okay. And then you respond back on December 30th as well. And you write, it was that high on rerun too, what do we think happened? To which then responds back to you, yes, high on rerun. Do you see that?
I do.
And then you respond back, okay, don't include on report. So are you instructing the team there not to include the CL test on the report?
I'm not sure. Reading it now, I read this to mean if you have concerns about the value, don't report the value. But again, I don't have recollection of this email exchange.
Okay. Why wouldn't you tell them to just include it on the report, but ask the patient for a redraw?
So I'm speculating here, but my understanding was if you think that the concentration is incorrect, then you should not include it.
Okay, but I guess I'm just wondering, why wouldn't you just include it but say, you know, this is too high, we can't rely on it, let's do a redraw?
I mean, I'm not a laboratory professional, but my understanding is if you believe it's wrong, you can't report it.
Okay, and so do you know if the person who was tested here was told that this result wasn't reported on his lab report?
I don't.
Did you make decisions like this for lab reports routinely?
No.
Okay, why were you making that decision this time?
Again, I can't remember this particular exchange. If it was someone who I was communicating with, then I would have been in the loop on these. And I mean, in general, my philosophy on all of this has been, if there's a question about a result, don't report it.
Okay, and you also mentioned that the the lab director would know what the practice was. Who was the lab director at this time? Was it still?
I think so, but I'm not sure.
So why wasn't he included on this email change?
I don't know. It looks like this was done as what's being referred to as a technology demonstration.
Was the lab director not involved in technology demonstrations?
I don't know.
Who would know whether that was the case?
Again, I would talk to Sunny.
Do you know if the same kind of review, which is, certain test results are coming back too high, should we remove it or should we keep it on? Do you know if those types of conversations were taking place within Theranos with respect to regular patient testing?
They should have been, but I now know that we had not effectively implemented our quality system.
Okay, and who would have been managing that process, reviewing patient results?
It was the job of the lab director and the director of quality for the clinical lab.
Okay, and who did they report to?
Functionally up to Sunny.
Okay. Did you have any supervision, or did you have any responsibility for overseeing that part of the business?
To the extent I'm the CEO of the company, I'm responsible for the company, but no, I was not engaged in it.
Why don't we take a short break, a little over an hour?
Sure.
This concludes media number 3 of Elizabeth Holmes. We're off the record at 3:46.